Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. I was just so wrapped up in my incredibly engrossing, deep exploration of humanity through the medium of storytelling. You know what's incredible? I don't even care that the pages all look the same, or that it's all so plain and boring to look at. In fact, I think that helps me focus on just the story. And that is the most important part, right? The story? Well, that's what we're going to explore in this video. Hello, and welcome to the channel. I'm Nick, and I make videos about things that I like. Really, that's kind of anything from the designs of cool products that I found to all kinds of gaming-related stuff. Today, we're going to focus on the latter. So if you're new here, feel free to subscribe and ring the bell, and if you're returning, maybe do that as well. Now, first things first, I'm not trying to argue story isn't important. That would be kinda ridiculous. However, I do feel sometimes there is a bit too much focus given to a game's story over its mechanics and other elements. And that can have really negative trickle-down effects on the industry as a whole. Now, while obviously a good game will often have a balance of the two, I think sometimes we have a tendency to focus most on whether or not the story is compelling or unique in some way in order to justify us liking that game. I think a lot of us still have people in our lives who don't really see the value of games, and so an easy thing to point to justify doing this thing that you like is to tell them how groundbreaking it is from a classical perspective that they might actually be able to understand. And that's something I find myself doing a lot. I think a lot of us tend to lean on story as a form of thought-terminating cliche, if you will, rather than an actual argument for the quality of a game. I would argue that this is the reason that you see all kinds of lore discussion around games that aren't really that deep. And sure, that also is just a fun exercise that kind of helps us connect more with our games in a bit of a deeper way, but it also stems from the idea that unless a game has a deep and sprawling narrative, it's just that, a game. And games are for kids. And when we're trying to explain to someone who doesn't have the same level of interest or respect for games that we do, I think it can become an easy thing to fall back on to try to give your favorite game, and games as a whole, legitimacy. But okay, why am I pointing all this out? Why am I making a whole video about it? Well, for one, because this is my channel, and I make videos about things that I'm interested in. But also because I think this particular issue has the potential to negatively affect the gaming industry as a whole when assumed to always be true. And while I'm certainly not conceited enough to think that this video is going to save the games industry or anything, it's something that has been on my mind, and I figured it might be a good thing to make a video about. To me, one of the most problematic potential effects of this kind of mindset is probably an increase in negative sentiment towards smaller indie or AA games that can't afford to prioritize story in their game, or simply don't want to for creative reasons. Indie games are an incredibly important part of the gaming industry, and they're a part that still doesn't get enough love in my opinion. Sure, it's all well and good to have a bunch of huge budget AAA games that boast massive maps and extensive romancing options with insane graphics and interesting and engaging mechanics. But at the root of all of those advancements and achievements are passionate people making something that they love and making something they want to exist. And believe me, they didn't get that way from spending 4 years studying business or marketing. Now, don't get me wrong, the money side is an incredibly important part of games creation and absolutely plays a big role in its success both commercially and in its audience reception. However, my point is that the people making the decisions that make the game good and successful as a game need to be passionate and dedicated to the art and craft of designing a game. And so much of that passion and drive comes from indie games and smaller titles pushing the envelope and using their smaller size to their advantage to try something much more interesting than any massive studio could afford to try. Huge multinational corporations can't afford to spend a ton of time working on a concept that will really ultimately only appeal to a relatively small number of people, even if it will appeal to the nth degree with those people. A smaller studio, on the other hand, is much better able to focus their attention on that one interesting thing and really flesh it out to its full potential. Because even though they'll only be able to sell it to a relatively small number of people, they didn't spend the same amount of resources that a larger company would have had to spend. In effect, you can think of the indie games scene and smaller studios as a kind of R&D department for the games industry. testing out new, interesting ideas and seeing how they work out. My point with explaining this is that this R&D department supports the larger devs by being able to explore new, interesting concepts. Concepts which are thought up by people who live games and who are deeply passionate about how they can be better. And most devs are people who just love games and grew up playing games with their friends and family, and they just want to share their awesome ideas for how games can improve with the world. But okay, we agree indie games are important to the industry, but why do I keep going on about the devs themselves as people? Well, because games are made by people, at least for now, and so while it's always important to be critical of the things that you like and not just dogmatically agree with every decision, it's also important to remember that these people are people, and if the project that they've been spending so much of their time on ultimately just gets shat on by the internet the second that it releases, that's going to be pretty discouraging. Now, I'm going to say something that might be kind of controversial here, but please stick with me. Your opinions on a game's mechanics, execution, and direction don't matter. And I'm not just saying that to be mean, I'm absolutely included in that as well. It's not our place as users to critique a game. I would argue it's not even really up to reviewers to do that. Their job is to tell you if you should buy it, and if not, then who should buy it. The only people who should be critiquing a game are other game devs who have been specifically asked by the creator, i.e. peer critique, or users who, again, were specifically asked for their thoughts. This is something that is often confused online. There's a common misconception that just because you put your art out on the internet for people to view freely, that means that you're asking for critique from all of them, and weighing it equally among all of them. Now, to be clear, that is just part of posting your art on the internet. People will inevitably give their 2 cents. The issue lies when those people think that their opinion is just as valid as somebody that the creators actually know and respect as another creative in their field. You can kind of think of it as a peer review in the academic field. You wouldn't ask for a peer review from just the general public. Their opinions don't matter to you with your research. And what this usually looks like in games is review bombing, or as it's more colloquially known, brigading. This is where a small but angry group of people absolutely inundate a game's, usually Steam page, with negative reviews. The reason that this is so effective is because it affects the way that the game is shown to potential buyers. On Steam specifically, it affects the game's overall rating, which can be anywhere from overwhelmingly positive all the way down through to overwhelmingly negative. Most gamers will think twice about whether they want to buy a game or not if it has anything under mostly positive. So the goal is to try to get the cumulative score down as far as possible in order to hit the company that made it where it hurts. Now, on the surface, this seems like an actually kind of cool and very internet way of dealing with companies being companies. However, this often devolves into death threats and harassment of individuals at the company, rather than simply righteous indignation and coherent arguments against the company as a whole and the practice or creative choice that was theoretically the actual cause of the uproar. A cause which is often any little thing. Most of the time, it isn't actually something worth destroying a game's reputation for. This usually happens to game sequels that didn't do every single little thing the fanbase expected, or in genres that have, shall we say, less than nuanced takes on their feminine presenting characters. It's usually just down to whether or not the heroine is traditionally sexy enough. If you want a really interesting discussion and exploration of this topic, specifically around gacha games, I highly recommend Moon Channel's videos on the subject. Now, in general, these tantrums can actually be an effective way to enact at least a little bit of change to a shitty business practice. Just look at the whole Helldivers situation, or Cyberpunk 2077. But when this practice turns its sights to a game made by a small team or indie studio, it has the potential to do a lot of harm. Not only because the people at these companies, and at any company, don't deserve to be harassed, period, but also because it builds an atmosphere of dread surrounding a game's launch. And because so much of indie game development is motivated by passion and drive to do something new and think outside the box, The thought of finally finishing a game after years of hard work just to have it crushed by some subreddit because it doesn't do exactly what they wanted it to, or live up to the lofty expectations that they built up for it, must be incredibly demotivating and stressful. And bringing it back to our discussion on the difference between peer critique and user feedback, this is exactly why there is a difference. It's incredibly important for creatives to learn to give different opinions about their work weight according to who's giving that opinion. Negative reviews of your game doesn't mean it's a bad game. People not liking your game because it doesn't have a great story, for example, doesn't mean your game is bad, especially if you were never intending to do that in the first place. But that filtering is incredibly difficult to do, especially when it affects how you're compensated for your work. The human element of games is one that I don't think gets focused on enough in mainstream discussions. As with any creative medium, motivation and drive to keep being creative is highly mood and atmosphere dependent. So if we as gamers make that atmosphere increasingly more toxic, we shouldn't be surprised if games as a whole get worse. Games are in the incredibly unique position of still being fairly early in their development as a medium, and that means that we have the opportunity to try tons of really interesting and unique ideas that explore the bounds of that medium. And yeah, not all of them are going to land, and yes, we will absolutely lose money on games that we don't really like all that much. But at least to me, even if the idea is interesting and the execution is clearly thought out and polished, I don't care if the actual idea itself doesn't quite work. The exploration is worth the price of entry. And that's what exploration and boundary pushing is all about. Creative people should never be afraid to fail. Failure is such an important part of the creative process, and that's just as true in game development. And we, as essentially the entire reason a company can afford to release a game at all, need to look at those failures not as reasons why no one should buy that game and the company that made it should cease to exist, but as important and worthwhile advancements to the medium. After all, if we bring it back to the analogy of smaller budget and indie games being the game industry's R&D department, it wouldn't make much sense for a company to shut it down just because they failed once or twice. That's the whole point of R&D, to explore new ideas, break things, and figure out what works and how to best implement it. The difference is just that the games industry's R&D department is publicly available and funded largely by us gamers. So we as gamers need to try to treat our employees way better than we do. And part of that is being okay with a game not giving us some huge sprawling story and open world. Sometimes it's just enough to have fun and engaging mechanics that your players want to keep coming back to because they're inherently satisfying and fun to engage with. Now, to be clear, I'm certainly not saying you should never give a bad review of a game. Reviews are very important and useful, and they have their place, but it's important, as with all criticism, to be constructive and not make it about the individuals making the game, but about the ideas in the game and how they may have failed. And to keep in mind that while it's always helpful to hear different perspectives and opinions on your work, they are by no means under any sort of obligation to take your suggestions. Your suggestions, while valuable, don't carry anywhere near the weight that those of a fellow game dev who actually knows the background info about the game do. Because we can't afford to drive the passion out of all the indie devs who do so much work, largely on their own personal time, to advance this thing that we love so much and feel so strongly about. If we create an environment where all that matters is what the market says that it wants, we'll end up with games full of microtransactions, gotcha mechanics, and enticing but meaningless gameplay. And I don't know about you, but that's very much not a place that I ever want to see the games industry in, at least any more than it already is. I started this video out by saying that games are more than just their story, and I absolutely believe that, but I realize I've kind of taken you on a bit of a journey through my brain here, so I'll try to wrap this up and tie it all together for you. My point with all of this is that while for many games story is an incredibly important element, it's just one part of a very large pie. So if you personally really enjoy story in your games, that's great, I'm totally with you. But maybe just consider, before you tear into a game for its lack of deep philosophical story, that perhaps the people making it are actual real people, experimenting with a medium that they love, and trying new things, and learning and growing as creatives. A great story adds a huge amount to a game, but it is by no means a required element. And creativity needs a positive and open-minded environment to thrive just as much as it needs peer critique and user feedback. So if we want to keep seeing amazing advancements in game design like we have been for a while now, we need to make sure that we garner that kind of environment for games to release into. An environment where devs can be excited about showing their cool new ideas to the world, and an environment which is excited about new releases from new studios, trying new things, rather than just uncharitably skeptical of every single choice that's been made. But that's all for today's video. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed what we talked about, and maybe you learned something along the way. Either way, I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a like if you liked it, and dislike if you disliked it. Leave a comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and all of that. And once you're done with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and as always, happy gaming.